Welcome, Zach. How are you doing?
Hey, Jonathan. Yeah, it's good to be here with you.
Yeah, it's been a while, and the snow is getting better there in Vermont. Or are you still inundated?
It's the last grasp of winter here in February, but spring doesn't really come till like April. So
Right. There's a Josh Ritter song I know. It's been a long time coming, but the snow is gone. I don't know if you know it, but when I was living in the US, I had that feeling of like, when is this bloody thing going to end?
that's right.
So yeah. All right, good. Well, listen, we're here to discuss your rather extraordinary and I think very important, in that word's bandied around, but I really do think this is an important piece of work. You've written an essay called Education Must Make History Again, with a subtitle, Remembering Comenius in a Time Between Worlds. Um, my sense is there's four things to talk about here, and we'll try and get through them with due sort of swiftness and pointedness. The first is, again, the idea of education. Once more, I know you're probably tired of giving your fuller view, but it just doesn't do any harm to just keep coming back to what you mean by that. Secondly, the notion of being in a time between worlds. um Thirdly, the life and times of Comenius.
Mhm.
And fourthly, like what it means now. Right now, you can choose which order you want to take them in, but if you can begin by speaking to um, what motivated you to write the essay, and I will try and intercept to get to those 4 points, which are my sort of lodestars for this conversation. But you should feel free to say whatever you want to say about the motivation and the background to this piece of work.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a thrill to me to have it out, frankly, because it came about in a rather strange, almost kind of synchronistic manner. I'm a philosopher of education. I have been for decades, and I'd never heard of this man, John Amos Comenius, who's arguably the most important educational philosopher who's ever lived. Um, and I encountered him doing research into the Rosicrucian movement. This is how I first encountered him. So I wasn't like looking through the annals of the philosophy of education. It wasn't in the materials that I had been exposed to as a graduate student or even in my own work. Um, Going back, I bet there were mentions, but I just didn't pick it up, right? But I was reading Francis Yates's book on the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, which is a fascinating work. And there's an entire chapter in there on Comenius and his invisible college, which kind of gets at the esoteric dimensions of Comenius's practice. But she alluded to this whole broad, sweeping, universal education reform initiative that Comenius was more famous for. And so I started to go down this rabbit hole, and one thing led to another, and I started to have these textual synchronicities and a whole bunch of things pushing me in the direction of grappling with Comenius. And it took years to even bring the text together because he's so neglected in the English language that it's hard to even get the text. They're out of print. And so it was an in-depth project to just make sense of this remarkable figure. And what is so striking was that he was holding education in a similar way to how I understand education, which is to understand it as not something that takes place in schools. And understand for Comenius, schools were not like what we're thinking. What we think of as schools was basically Comenius's idea. What was schools in his day were basically these little cloistered religious things and guilds,
Mhm.
basically. But there weren't public schools at all. And the idea that everyone should be educated and that there should be a large kind of like state-sponsored institution to handle that responsibility, like none of that was in play. Those are all Comenius's ideas. But in order to have that innovation in thinking about the institutionalization of education, you have to think of education as deeper than any of its current institutionalizations. And so this is what he was doing. He was conceiving of it as an extremely basic social function, and even more deeply as like a cosmological function,
Right.
that intergenerational transmission, which is to say the passing on of knowledge to the next generation, the giving them the skills and dispositions that their ancestors had. That process for Comenius is like the way that the world makes itself, that the universe itself is in a sense engaging in a process of passing on what has been gathered and evolving.
Right.
And so now Comenius is, of course, way before Darwin, but there was a time when.
Just situate him in time for us, Zach. Time and place, just for people who don't know him.
So he was sometimes known as the incomparable Moravian, right? He was from Bohemia, which is a region we now call the Czech Republic, essentially Prague and that area. So on the turning of the 17th centuries when he lived, so he's born in the 1500s, he dies in the 1660s. And this is a remarkable time in history, just full stop. That's the other thing that I started to realize as I was exploring Comenius's story, was that the reason he was able to see education in a deeper way was because which is to say deeper than any of its given institutional forms currently, was because those current institutional forms were radically in flux during the 16th century. More specifically, he was kind of witness to the beginning of the 30 Years' War, which is a kind of a complex story, but this was it was a devastating period of European history. Some people believe that it should be understood as the actual kind of First World War because of the total extensiveness of the damage and destruction that took place there. And so that war was kind of a religious war, but it was also the war that represented the end game of the medieval system and the kind of birth of a fundamentally new way of doing social organization, which we came to call basically modernity, which is this combination of capitalism and nation states. And so Comenius was living in this, what I call a time between worlds, and we can get to that technically. But it was in that context that he saw, oh my, the main event here, even though there's economic things changing and there's political things changing, the main event is how we're going to continue to be human, was his argument.
Right.
Like that, there's a certain form of education, which he believed was kind of God-given, but a certain form of education that we need to stay loyal to and innovate in relation to in order to humanize ourselves and to continue to deepen our humanity. So during this tumultuous period, he was focusing on the very fundamentals of education, conceived not as schooling, but rather as this necessary kind of social function. And so he innovated with printing press technology to create what were basically hands down the most influential textbooks. I mean, he invented the textbook basically, and specifically the child's picture book and the kind of instructional text-based kind of like way of engaging. Kind of created that with the Orbis Pictus and had all of these, broad sweeping ideas about large-scale institutional reform. And he worked with Sweden and England and other areas to think about recreating the medieval system and turning it into what we would now call basically a public educational system that would be inclusive of everyone: men, women, disabled, poor, rich. Like this was a crazy idea at the time.
Right. Yeah.
Like literally crazy.
Right.
And there was a small group of people who thought he was crazy. And then there was a small group of people who thought he was absolutely correct and gave him a tremendous amount of support, especially in England before the Civil War. Comenius was right there, working with people to create this invisible college, which would eventually become the Royal Society. So I tell all this in the paper. This is all told in the paper. So I'm kind of moving quite quickly. Yeah. But the story is basically, I discovered like a world historical figure who was a philosopher of education, right, and just couldn't put it down basically until I pulled all of the lessons from it that I could pull for our current historical moment, because it's a similar moment. And it requires us to reconceive education as profoundly as Comenius did, basically.
Huh. So, yeah, like you say, it's an intricate history and a fascinating period of time that we don't maybe think about enough. We're so busy thinking about what comes after modernity or whether modernity is over that we often forget like how it began and what we were thinking at the time. And I'm struck by what you said about the sense of almost calling to write this, because those who know you well will be aware of your book, Education in a Time Between Worlds, but also more generally, your commitment to a view of education that is like Comenius, not the kind of education that most people think of when the word pops up. And this is a matter of no small importance, because people at a marketing level want to reduce education to learning or training. Schooling. So some who want to make it about schooling, because that's sort of the institutional, policy-driven way of doing it, top-down managerial, here's the curriculum, off you go. Others who say, no, we don't want schooling, we want learning, lifelong learning, transformative learning, all this. You're quite invested in the term education as such. And I've noticed you're always quite keen to get it in your titles, and I'm sometimes trying to get it out. And there's kind of, you're committed to this term, not just what it represents, but somehow there's something going on there, Zak. I'm just keen to know what is it about insisting on education in its fullest sense that matters to you so much?
I mean, it's an interesting question. It's like I'm kind of fighting over the correct way to use the term.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm fighting for a distinction between education and schooling,
right,
in particular, which I kind of already mentioned, that there's a deeper way to conceive of education. Now, some people would prefer that I call it like enculturation.
Right.
I often call it intergenerational transmission.
Or social autopoiesis as well.
Or social autopoiesis, right? So there's like this word clusters.
Yeah.
And I think the word that I like the most is education, because it's overlapping with what people should be thinking, which is like large scale efforts,
right,
to affect the trajectory of the youth and to give necessary skills, right? So that's what but most people think of it as schooling. That's the most of the reaction that I get, or something that's done in a kind of state mandated, centralized, kind of organized, curricularized kind of manner. And I'm saying that's all education, but my definition's broader. And it's basically a Deweyan definition. It's more almost exactly how that all the institutions of a society are educational in some respect.
Right.
And there are some institutions in the society that take it as their reflective, dedicated mission to be educational. But even if you're not claiming to be educational, you are in some sense creating educational impact, which is to say that the whole society affects the turning over of the guard, right? The whole society affects the process of intergenerational transmission and the bringing of the younger generation into the roles of responsibility necessary to take over the society. So that process of intergenerational transmission writ large, and all the medium and institutions and media that allow for that, relationships and contexts, that's all for me education. So it's a very big, broad term. And the reason I'm doing that is because we're in a period, as I already mentioned, where we actually need to think more deeply about education than we're thinking about any of its particular instantiations, because like digital is the greatest example of this. It's like you could think all you want about solving the problem of schooling, but you can't predict where the digital is going. So actually you need to understand education more deeply than schooling, because we could be in a situation where schools are basically obsolete, which is, I think, the case. Schools as we know them are obsolete, right as we're in an educational renaissance. So in order to be able to say that, you have to disentangle education from schooling, because if it's the case you don't do that, then as the schools start to get discombobulated and the schools stop working, you think we're screwed educationally, instead of saying, actually, this is a huge educational opportunity. Now, that said, you also need to separate education from entertainment and propaganda. And propaganda in particular was something that Comenius was grappling with. This is another thing. Like, I've got an incredible book on propaganda from the 30 Years' War. And the work that I did with the Consilience Project on those propaganda papers, there's some stuff in there about the propaganda from the 30 Years' War in particular, and it has to do with the printing press and the asymmetric capacity for distributing information that those who owned the printing press had. And they were very clever because not everyone could read. So they would make these complex pictures and caricatures, right? And so it was very visceral and grabbing, and of course, pulling on the religious ideology, and kind of like the hell in particular became an object of deepening propaganda. That because you have Protestants and Catholics warring, basically, each one threatening the other with worse versions of hell. And so Christian hell in particular got a lot more scary over the course of the 30 Years' War as a result of competing propaganda campaigns. And one of Comenius's move was to say, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to get my own printing presses and create basically anti-propaganda, which are his picture books, which are equally entertaining and kind of viscerally grabbing you, but serving to empower you by giving you more complex language and ways to think about the world.
Things we take for granted now. I mean, things that
Yes.
my children have been reading for years now, and they're just part of the fabric of the world. But they weren't always. They were an idea made manifest by technology at some level.
Yes.
So I'm struck by the fact, Zak, that you look ever so slightly like Comenius. And I only say that as a little jibe, partly because I am struck by some of the parallels. Now I know Comenius was, like you say, a world historical figure. He traveled all over the world. He was, I believe, and you give detailed footnotes about this, invited to become president of Harvard. And I also, there's stories of many governments seeking his help on how to make education happen. And it was also a time between worlds, as today is. And you think with a similar level of sort of depth and breadth and sort of controlled urgency. So I'm just all the more reason for this message to get through. Now, one of the good things is alongside this essay about Comenius, Education Must Make History Again, we also re-released one of your prior pieces of work, which we've given the title, Education is the Metacrisis. Now, just to sort of elaborate on what you just shared, can you further clarify what you mean by saying the problems of the moment are fundamentally educational? And then we'll come back to Comenius and then compare the two times.
Yeah, I mean, and this is in a sense Comenius's argument. He was saying, listen, there's all this religious war, there's famines, there's economic breakdown. What's the root of all that? It's basically that we're miseducated, that the ways that we are kind of taking responsibility for shaping the youth and for passing on, we're beginning to fail at that. And therefore we are becoming less than human. We're dehumanizing one another because we don't know what it means to appreciate our humanity because we haven't been educated well enough. And so the idea is that like the surface crises, which are most obvious, like violence and economic breakdown, and in our case, other things like political polarization and ecological collapse and things like that, those are all crises. And so my definition of the metacrisis is, well, what's the root? Not the additive summation of all of those, but the generator function beneath them. And it looks like something like the mishandling of that educational task that a civilization has.
It's like, how would you put it? It's like losing track of what it means to be human or something like that.
Losing track of, that's an interesting way to put it. I mean, human's a difficult word, right? Yeah. But it is something more like losing touch with shared reality.
Right.
Something like that, where
this whole, hang on, to stay with that for a second, losing touch with shared reality. So that would be, would you add on individuals losing touch with shared reality, or who is losing touch with shared reality? Everyone is?
So it would be in the process of intergenerational transmission. There's like a whole bunch of friction and noise, which means that a lot of what is occurring is not in touch with reality. So it's like saying that we're starting to mishandle this essential social function. So it's like, the problem's not CO2 in the atmosphere. It's how we're thinking about CO2 in the atmosphere. And the problem's not the other political party. It's how we're thinking about the other political party, and vice versa. So that the root is more at the nature of the psyche, and the root of the psyche, the intergenerational.
I know you want to be careful there, because it could sound there like you were saying none of that is actually biologically real or politically real. It's just some kind of social construction. You're not saying that. You're saying something more about how we orient to reality being the sort of foundation of all the myriad problems that are there. It's
precisely because those things are very real, and we don't have a good handle on them.
Right.
We need to slow down and be much more deliberate in our educational
Right.
processes and institutions,
Yeah.
things of that.
So I hope I'm not pushing this point too much, but it just seems so fundamental. So there's something about contact reality. Now that can sometimes be described as the sacred. It can be descriptively called ontology. It might even be metaphysics. But there's something about reality at the root level that humans, when they're not in a time between worlds, sort of seem to have a decent handle on. They know what to do. They make contact with things and the world sort of makes sense. And then through historical forces, technological, social forces, including wars, including ecological collapse, including economic pressures of various kinds, changes in population and so forth, people begin to lose their way and struggle to know what's going on. And that manifests as not quite knowing what it is to be human anymore. And again, parsing that word for all its baggage. And struggling to convey to those who want to know and need to know what is real and what it is to be human in relationship to the real. And that's something like that. Again, put it in your own words, please, but it's something like that you're getting at, that fundamental principle of what you call social autopoiesis, but the way that society sort of renews and reorganizes itself. When that begins to break down, that's the deepest of all the problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so in that paper that you mentioned, Education is the Metacrisis, which was re-released, kind of break down the things that are necessary to secure, which is to say the things that need to be handled during intergenerational transmission for us to keep having this civilization as a cooperative project. And so one of them is something like that we make sense of a shared objective reality together. And that's what I was mentioning. So that would be like the intelligibility crisis or crisis of sense making, right?
Which is big, which is really big now, right?
Which is huge, which is like what is actually the case with the radiation coming out of Fukushima. Who are the elders who know the story about that? And who are the young ones who are having that knowledge transmitted to them? Now, this is a very interesting question, this question in particular, because there's dozens of questions like this that have to do with the controversial state of essential knowledge, scientific knowledge, knowledge about the state of our infrastructure, warfare, economics, knowledge that's very difficult to come to terms with, that is politicized. And so the question of, is that knowledge about reality being transmitted or not, is an interesting question. So that's one, just intelligibility. And you can see it's not that we don't know what's happening, although that is occurring too. There are questions so complex that literally the elders have no idea what's going on and they're passing over the question. But then there are realities we actually aren't in touch with, which we're not willing to face for whatever reason, corruption or fear, which we're not passing on intentionally or distorting the passing on of that knowledge. And that's just in one domain. Now, this is related to other things we need to have set to keep going together as a cooperative project. One of them is legitimacy, which is to say, legitimacy
related to that, because of course, you know, who gets to say who knows and on what basis they know when. Exactly.
So we're passing on knowledge, and then we're also passing on kind of trust in the legitimacy of our ongoing institutions. And so that's a very complex thing to pass on, because it's not passing on a set of propositions, which is what passing on knowledge is. This is true, this is true, this is true, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. This is passing on a set of dispositions and also a kind of, you know,
social mores or something. Yeah.
Social mores, like an ethos.
Yeah.
And so I'm claiming that we're failing to pass on knowledge, just sheer knowledge, and we're failing to create conditions where faith in the legitimacy of our institutions is fostered in those people who are going to take them over. And this is what's so kind of nearsighted about the generation narcissism that often affects educational crises, is that, hey, mom and dad, grandpa, you will pass on and you will have to hand over this institution and all the realities and legitimacy complexities that come with it to younger people.
Right.
And what that means is you need to clean up your act well enough that you can pass it on without shame. And I think a lot of what's occurring with the breakdown in intelligence and what are sometimes called, you know, like failed ways of being, Um, and so intelligibility, legitimacy, and then there's also meaning making, which is in a sense deeper than all of those, which isn't what's happening or kind of who's in charge or why are they in charge, who gets to decide. It's about what does it all mean.
Sure.
Exactly. And so you can see, you can kind of take the educational issue apart into its subcomponents and realize that keeping civilization going is a task that requires a tremendous amount of investment in that process of intergenerational transmission, which will absolutely not just take care of itself. And so in that sense, the Metacrisis definition that I work with is that it's not saying at all that there isn't an ecological crisis or, crisis of potential warfare. And it's saying it's precisely because those are very real that we need to be much more concerned with how those processes of knowledge transmission and legitimacy conveyance are actually occurring.
Right. So, and I know you have, there's more to say there, and then both of the essays, have a lot more to say on the meaning of education philosophically like that. I'm wondering if one of the reasons people struggle to get excited about education in this context of seeing it as part of the metacrisis. I mean, I've noticed, for example, as you know, I wrote an essay on Bildung a few years back, and it was an attempt to say basically that my hope for dealing with anthropogenic climate change was ultimately educational. And that was partly inspired by reading your book and then making sense of things for myself. It was partly inspired by the work of Lena Rachel Anderson and Thomas Bjorkman and The Nordic Secret, and thinking through that, what do civilizations do to learn how to become who they have to be? And I know that one of your things, by the way, in addition to meaning and intelligibility and legitimacy, was also capability.
Right.
I say this because while I was trying to make this case, some people got it, but some didn't. And I'm wondering if some of this is a kind of intra-generational narcissism. I'm wondering if, when you speak in terms of passing on from one generation to the other, the kind of curriculum of what it is to be human and what it is to be in touch with reality, I wonder if a certain portion of people are just so into themselves and so caught up in their projects that they feel it can't possibly be more than one generation. That I wonder if there's a certain, people are in fix-it mode so much that they feel they can't, generations, give or take 18 years or whatever, that when you speak in terms of, we have to look at the sort of way that society organizes itself, the way that generations share what they, and also this is maybe where you can help me a little bit with those distinctions between types of culture in terms of the extent to which the knowledge needed by the next generation is the same as the prior generation. But what I'm getting at in this question, though, is insofar as people are not animated by education the way that you clearly are, I wonder if some of it is because what you're hearing is something about the beauty of the organism across time and space, across many generations. And there's a kind of underlying order or pattern to that needs to be attended to. And that's where the beauty and the purpose lies for you. But I wonder, for many today, things are happening so Twitter quick all the time that it's like, really, I have to slow down and think in terms of years and decades and across generations. I don't have time. I've got to get going. There's a bit of that. My instinct is there might be some of that going on, at least at the marketing level. But anyway, remind me, please, about this thing about the type of culture, the extent to which it needs to understand the prior generations' knowledge of things, and how that links back to Comenius as well.
Totally, yeah. Margaret Mead's distinctions in culture and commitment. So I'll get to those, and you're absolutely correct that there's something kind of odd in our culture, which has us neglecting this task of intergenerational transmission. And it'll seem odd to say that because it seems like maybe we invest a lot in education, and in one sense we do, and we're obsessed with our children, but we don't understand history. And so this would be basically an issue with modernity, and especially post-modernity. And it's been noted by the commentators, especially on post-modernity, that we've become ahistorical, that we live outside of an historically informed, action-orienting self-understanding. So that we basically as you said, we don't think in terms of generations because we don't think in terms of history. And so we live in like this weird specious present, a kind of a ahistorical kind of presentism is sometimes how it's described. And even when we look back at prior historical epochs, we critique them by our own standards as if they're happening right now.
If we were the reality and everything else wasn't kind of real somehow.
Correct. So there's something about that kind of, and this is part of maybe what it means to be in a time between worlds, is that you're kind of taken out of the flow of historical time and even out of the flow of biological time, or ahistorical, post-biological. So if you're ahistorical and post-biological, then it's precisely the case that you're not really thinking about future generations.
I think I know what you mean by ahistorical, but post-biological, you mean what exactly?
Meaning that those things that used to not be up to us, that were a part of our biological constitution, we believe now are within our control.
I see.
So that goes all the way to
manipulating DNA and synthetic biology and this kind of stuff, right?
Solving death, right, as Google is trying to do. And of course, age extension technology and death-defying technology radically disrupts intergenerational transmission, actually in completely catastrophic ways that most people don't really consider because we're not thinking in terms of how history works. Right. That's one argument, is that, yeah, you're right. We don't think in terms of history in general. We're ahistorical, post-biological, and therefore we don't really think about the next generation. That, coupled with the fact we have a ethical framework in general that basically says you are of value depending upon your ability to contribute to the social field. Now, which is to say, like, there's no free lunch, that one does not give of oneself in order to therefore receive nothing. And one once returns on investments that are identifiable and immediate to one's own person. And so what that means is that although we're obsessed with our children, actually investing in them is not something we want to do. And we are, as a culture, resentful of those members of the culture who don't actually contribute to the culture. And so we neglect them. And so the idea would be that the basic ethical stance one has to take to be an educator is, I give to you without seeking reward, because you will inhabit a world that I do not see, right? So all the benefit that I give to you, I don't, maybe like in some other, like my memory lives on in you or whatever, but at the end of the day, in a very selfish biological way, there's hard in our culture to marshal the ethical resources to truly not narcissistically invest in our kids, but to actually take a loss today for the sake of a gain that we will not see tomorrow. And that's what we have to do as a culture. And so that's why I think we avoid education, because it would actually point a very strong finger at the irresponsibility and what I think is the low grade forms of child abuse that are running throughout the culture. Because we actually resent the freeloaders who are these kids who are disrupting the narcissistic, selfish calculus that our culture forces upon us. So in that context,
right, that heated charge context,
Margaret Mead sees this. She saw this coming. Like, there were cultures that were not post-historical or ahistorical or post-biological, where it was very clear that my kids are going to be doing what I did, and I did what my grandparents were doing, and they did what their grandparents were doing, and there was easily identifiable skills and dispositions that it was your sacred responsibility to pass on. And so those are what Margaret Mead would call post-figurative cultures, that the thing has already been kind of built, the image of what it means to be human has already been built, and we kind of inherit that. A lot of people think we're kind of still in that situation, but we've been out of that situation for a very long time. And then there are these co-figurative cultures where the models of our grandparents are still relevant, but contexts are changing enough that within generational learning is taking place, so that we don't quite exactly pass over the same thing, and we subtly incentivize innovation in the youth. And that's a co-figurative culture. And then there's what Mead called pre-figurative cultures. And this is what she claimed that we were in now, which is that actually we don't know what our children will be doing. We do know that it's very different from what grandpa and grandpa did. And so it's a situation where there's a very significant change in the intergenerational transmission dynamic, where there is a much smaller number, but a much more important set of things that the elders actually have to pass on, and that the youth is responsible in large part for identifying key sets of new skills and dispositions and actually educating the elders to a certain extent. And so that flip occurred.
Right.
Margaret Mead would say probably around World War I or World War II, where we were just undeniably in a situation of being in that type of culture, where the classic way we thought about education, where it's like, oh, we know what we're doing, kids, here, do what we did. We know we can give you predictions and get this kind of job in the future and invest in this 401k and all of that stuff because we can predict where it's going. And like, that's gone. And we're and we have an intuition of this, but we're not quite clear on it, which is why there's an ambivalence actually in intergenerational transmission, right? The adults often think, well, I don't really know what's going to be like. I don't know what to teach you, kid. And by the way, we really messed up.
Also,
so like how, yeah.
What I think I've noticed there is as well, culturally, if you think of major films or stories, there aren't many that are kind of prefigurative cultures. They're mostly historically quite flat, typically, in that we were expected to take on something happen. You know, the story might have intergenerational aspects, but rarely will the nature of what needs to be learned be very different from what needed to be learned before. You know, the dramatic setting has a similar kind of morphology to the prior generations. And there aren't many films, at least I can think of, where the challenge is precisely that different generations have different kind of learning imperatives.
This is,
yeah.
And it's becomes very complex, right? So you can see how and this was Mead's point, right? The faster the rate of technological change, the faster the rate of culture change, the greater the generational gap. Right. The greater the generational gap, the greater the difficulty of intergenerational transmission.
Right. So to be clear, why does it matter that? Like, why, if it's the case, so I'm just wondering, I mean, you maybe about to explain this, but it would be open to a skeptic here or somebody who wasn't buying it, as it were, to say, hang on the one hand, you're telling me education really matters because intergenerational transmission really matters. But you're also conveying to me that we live in a prefigurative culture where intergenerational transmission is of a certain kind, which means that we don't actually know what the next generation needs. And is that why, if I can finish the point, education as such and not learning is what matters? Because what you're passing on is something more about how to make contact with reality, how to be human, and so forth, rather than learning calculus or learning whatever else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now you're getting it. It's like, it's a weird paradox. And that's why we have to think about education fundamentally differently. Because we keep thinking about it as schooling, basically on the model of a post-figurative or configurative culture. Then we're going to completely set children up to just basically completely fail. So we need to be able to understand, oh my goodness, we're in a structurally fundamentally different educational situation, and all the institutions and technologies are changing. So what education will look like 10 years from now, what we should want it to look like 10 years from now, it's very different from just like a better, more equitable public education system. It's actually so profoundly different, especially if you can include like Web3 in there and AI and all of this kind of stuff, that both the elders and the youth need to clarify what that relationship is and start to value that relationship so intensely, because what's being transmitted there is so different from what can be transmitted through digital kind of propositionally loaded kind of like knowledge transfer.
Right. And that's also why you're saying that what the curriculum, or maybe the hidden curriculum, depending on your language, between the generations now is distilled by those four questions, to which I might add a fifth, but roughly, you know, intelligibility, legitimacy, capability, and meaning. That somehow those are the terrains which still matter. You know, those terrains, regardless of what kind of culture you're in, you have to deal with questions of what's going on, who gets to decide on what basis, who has the authority, can we do what we're called upon to do, whether that's renewable energy in this generation, or finding a safe way to manage AI or whatever it is. And then meaning, like, we still have to pass on the question of, well,
Right.
what's worth living for and what matters. That's why when you say education in the time between worlds, it's attending to those kinds of questions. I would add the need to imagine a future, the role of imagination, that's another detail. But that's why, was Comenius up to that roughly? Or is he right? So because he's also in kind of a prefigurative context, right? Because,
well, he was in exactly that. So basically Mead was saying, like, usually in kind of, what we might call pre-modern or whatever, it would be prefigurative or configurative, but sometimes warfare or major ecological change would force a culture to migrate, in which case they would go to a new terrain where the elders didn't know what to do and the youth had to take over. So it occurred in history that you'd get occasionally thrown into a context of needing to become a prefigurative culture, more or less. And so because of the technological and economic changes in Comenius's time, there was exactly a situation where you couldn't trust the youth to be educated by the Catholics or the Protestants, because they would just be propagandized, right? And you couldn't trust the epistemologies of the Catholics or the Protestants, because there was this new natural science that was emerging since the Renaissance, which kind of was starting to undermine a lot of that epistemology. So you couldn't even pass down intelligibility wise, how does the storm work? Like, how do you navigate the ocean? Like, how do you deal with disease? Like, there were plagues and things in those days. So that's one of the reasons it's so interesting. It was that time between worlds becomes radically prefigurative. But then it restabilizes when you get the kind of, Westphalia and kind of like the move into what we think of as modernity, kind of reworlded, but in the context of rapidly changing acceleration of technologies. And so we ended up creating a society that was systematically accelerating its ability to undermine itself and got to a situation where we're now in a kind of perpetually prefigurative state, potentially. In the near term, you can't see it.
We're in a perpetually prefigurative state. Wow, I see what you mean. And what's coming to mind is, and I know you may have mixed feelings about Greta Thunberg as such, but there are these iconic moments where she's on stage in front of the UN saying, "You have failed my generation. You don't understand," which is sort of quintessentially younger generation telling older generation, "You don't know what to do. We have to learn how to do it and show you," in a sense. Right. Nothing she's right, but for what it's worth, it's an interesting illustration.
Well, and she's a great example, and not necessarily in a good direction, because the other eventuality of this pattern is generational warfare,
where
the generations take up purely strategic relationships to one another. And that's a recipe for civilizational collapse. Basically, you could almost argue that all civilizational collapses eventuate in something like intergenerational warfare, because it ends up being a situation where the change is so abrupt, and the obviously kind of decomposing civilization built by the elders is so problematic. There were some Marxists actually who thought that you would get an inevitability of intergenerational warfare as a sublimation of class warfare. And if you look at the situation today, it's interesting, right? Like, not really many baby boomers have a lot of cryptocurrency. A lot of young people have a lot of cryptocurrency. Not many baby boomers understand things like DAOs and distributed autonomous organizations and all of that stuff. So there's this basic play for all the marbles that's occurring at a intergenerational level. And so the okay boomer kind of dismissing of the boomers, and also you're privileged but stuck up and spoiled millennial, like, that's generational warfare. With not a prefigurative culture. Prefigurative culture, if you get it right, is actually a deep, profound collaboration between elder and youth,
which is what
knowing that we need one another,
and
not knowing exactly what that relationship is going to look like, but being willing to cooperate in the face of the unknown across varying asymmetries of knowledge and capacity depending on context. So it's it's a disposition towards intergenerational cooperation, as opposed to cross-generational resentment and warfare, which is what we're kind of moving towards now.
Right. So that's another educational imperative. It's baked in. And it's also, fascinatingly in some ways, because like I say, there's a motivational side to this story of education being the kind of priority and the preeminent focus for people who would wish to change or save even indeed the world. Which is that those who don't see themselves as educators, or those who feel as though education's what they've kind of moved out of and grown out of, and they're now on to other things and want to focus on political economy or technology or whatever. If what you're saying is, look, intergenerational cooperation is one of the means by which we have a chance of averting the worst kinds of catastrophe, and you have a theory of that which is about prefigurative cultures, the need for intergenerational transmission of a certain kind, including the Metacrisis description you gave, then you really have a recipe for, a very strong case for making intergenerational cooperation and understanding a preeminent social goal, and an educational goal, self-evidently an educational goal, learning how to be together across the generations. Right. And it's scary because it really does mean learning from, there are these films and examples of, the young people do the tech and the old people do the presentation, or, whatever, these kind of simplistic tropes, but it's deeper than that, right? Because as the source code of civilization begins to unravel, and you have these problems of intelligibility, capability, legitimacy, and meaning, getting together across the generations to address those things feels like a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for possibly for civilizational survival.
I agree. I mean, that's the thing I've been saying for a while. Now, it's not to say that the other technological and political and economic challenges aren't real. They're very real. But if we solve them and don't solve this problem, then they're only temporarily solved because we don't know how to pass on the solution.
Yeah, but also even solved isn't quite right? I mean, it doesn't even, I'm sure you'd agree, it doesn't quite make sense as a way of thinking about it. It's an ongoing predicament with multiple elements that are interacting in ways we can't really understand or predict.
So that's, in a sense, Comenius was, many hundreds of years ahead of his time.
Right.
And I kind of see him as, a little bit like he was meta-modern before there was the modern.
That's really funny.
He
was a pre-modern meta-modernist.
Exactly, that there was a path not taken right at the birth of modernity.
Right.
And that Comenius represented this other path, and many of his ideas are actually co-opted by what we know now as modernity.
Right. All right.
There was this opportunity for an education-centric, kind of radically inclusive society,
right?
Where capital was serving the function of human development, rather than capital kind of constraining and directing human development. And so Comenius kind of saw that. Now, we didn't take that direction, but the lessons are there. And there's a lot of stuff we didn't talk about, like a kind of perennial philosophy that was implicit in his.
Well, look, I'm thinking, if you have the appetite, we're nearing the end of the time we have today, but I feel as though we should maybe leave. There's a few things we haven't spoken about. One is a bit more about Comenius's view of the world, including the Invisible College and what a temple might mean today, and all of these things you wrote about. And there's also the very idea of being in a time between worlds, which we haven't really got to. But if you're willing, we could have another short session, just because we won't get to it now. But I'm keen to hear about those things as well.
Yeah, I would welcome that. Absolutely.
Okay, great. So there will be a part 2 for those watching this. But for now, thank you very much, Zak Stein. We're gonna, just because I've got to go and pick up my kids, life calls. Exactly. I will get back to this conversation soon and look forward to posting that as well. Okay, bye for now. I'll stop recording.